Myanmar wants to end its political and economic isolation, but the international attention has also been focusing on a bloody cycle of ethnic violence. As Myanmar moves towards more reform, is this the chance for the government to address the plight of the minorities? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Taimur Nabili. It is a country racked by desperate poverty and criticised for its political repression. But Myanmar is also standing at a crossroads as it embraces some sweeping changes. Foreign investors are queuing up to get a foothold in a nation that has vast natural resources. But ethnic violence is tainting the country's ambitions for reform. The latest unrest in western Myanmar has displaced tens of thousands of people and left more than 80 dead. And the victims are blaming the government for failing to prevent it. Wayne Hay reports from Sittwe in Myanmar's troubled Rakhine state.
As the number of people affected by the violence increases, so does the criticism of the government for its handling of the situation. That criticism coming from both the Rohingya Muslim community and the Rakhine Buddhist community, that the government has not done enough to ensure people's safety. The government says it is increasing the number of soldiers and police on the streets, but still there are many people right around Rakhine State that are living in fear that the violence could break out again at any time. As the number of newly displaced people surpasses 20,000, the total number of people that have been forced from their homes since this fighting first started way back in June is now around the 100,000 mark. And the majority of those people are Rohingya Muslims.
Well, Myanmar is one of the most diverse countries of Southeast Asia, a patchwork of more than 100 different ethnicities. Now, the Buddhist Burmans are the largest group in the country. They've historically lived in what have been the country's central and upper plains. Among the larger of the other ethnic groups are the Shan, the Karen, the Kachin, all of which have fought armed insurgencies against the Burmese junta. And then there are the Rohingya, one of Myanmar's smallest minorities. But it's their harsh treatment in recent weeks that's drawn international attention and condemnation. So will reforms help Myanmar's minorities and help the country's development? For this, I'm joined by three guests. In Singapore is Maitri Aung-Thwin, a historian of modern Southeast Asian history at the National University of Singapore and author of History of Myanmar Since Ancient Times. In Bangkok, Larry Jagan is a Southeast Asia specialist and former BBC World Service editor. And in Washington, D.C., Brian Joseph, Senior Director for Asia and Global Programs at the National Endowment for Democracy and a member of the Burma Donors Forum. Gentlemen, thank you all for being with us on the programme today. Maitri, can I begin with you, if I could? In a history of ethnic division, or at least ethnic cohabitation with a degree of division thrown in, how does this current situation rank as a threat to the structure of the country, as a serious problem in international terms?
Well, it's a very serious problem. It's in a very serious situation for the Myanmar government. And I think they're taking it very seriously. I mean, they've sent troops and police over there to try to stabilize the situation. And they've also immediately sent an inquiry commission made up of highly respected academics, civil society officials, as well as MPs from both sides of the table to go there and investigate to find out what's going on. And I think it's important that the Myanmar authorities respond in this way because they are under a lot of scrutiny by the international community who are interested in the types of reforms that have been going on for the last 20 years or so. And so it's very important for them to respond to this in a way that can hopefully bring some stability to that area. However, it's a long-term problem that's not going to be resolved in a matter of months, but probably in a matter of decades.
Larry Jagan, international coverage of this particular issue has tended to a certain extent to conflate the Buddhists in and around Rakhine State with the government and to a certain extent put a bit of blame on the government. Do they deserve that blame, or, as Maitri says, have they been doing as much as they can to help?
Well, I think in some ways the government has been doing as much as it can to help. I think, in fact, it's something of an independent player. I don't think it is supporting the Arakanese Buddhists, and it's obviously not supporting the Rohingyas. It has tried to re-establish law and order. If there is any complaint, it is that at times, particularly when the violence flares up, that the soldiers and the police stand by and don't interfere. That was certainly the case in June. I think this time, a week ago, the authorities were much more proactive. The government understands that this is a very important issue and that internationally it's attracted a lot of attention. We've actually seen some countries like Indonesia saying that if it isn't resolved, they will dissuade their businesses from investing in Burma altogether. So I think the government is trying to do what it can. But the Arakanese Buddhists are really on a rampage at the moment because they feel that they are misunderstood and that the growth of the Rohingya population, because after all they're polygamists and don't practice childbirth, are in danger of pushing them out of their own land.
OK, well, you mentioned investment, and we'll come on to that in a minute because it's an important element in all of this. But let's just, one final word on the ethnicity and political aspects of this. Let's go to Washington, D.C. For this. Brian, is the US's position on this as clear as it could be? I mean, they have embraced, to a certain extent, the idea of reform going on in the country. But should they not be doing more to try and acknowledge perhaps the role of the ethnic minorities in this development of Myanmar's politics?
Well, I think it's important to think about the Rohingyas as a very different group of people than the other ethnic nationalities. For years, we've all talked about reform in Burma basically involving three parties, the ethnic nationalities, the National League for Democracy, and the ruling junta at the time, the SPDC, and now the government. But the Rohingya are actually a stateless people and not one of the recognized ethnic minorities. And so when the U.S. government and other parties look at the situation in Burma now, there are really two different issues going on. One is looking at the fundamental nature of the state, the relationship between the periphery or the ethnic nationalities, you mentioned most of them in the beginning, the Shan, the Karen, the Karenni, the others, but also dealing with this particular issue, which is the Rohingya in Arakan state, and the problems that they face in grappling with this issue, they being the government in Burma, and the international community's response is very, very different than looking at the issues in the other states where there are actually armed insurgencies, and but they're also political organizations and entities in which you can work with.
Well, there's a valid distinction. I mean, the Rohingya are treated differently and they have a different status within the country. But Maitri, let me put it to you. I mean, at the end of the day, there's still the ethnic minority problem as a whole is the issue here, isn't it? I mean, the Karen have been fighting what must be one of the longest insurgencies in the world. The Kachin are still demanding a certain amount of their own autonomy. I mean, these problems are legion around the country.
I think these are long-term problems that are going to be part of the story of the nation-building project for decades to come. I mean, it's been part of the issue ever since the birth of the nation, that you had, in many ways, all these different communities who were competing for and arguing over what it is to be part of this nation or what is to be part of a separate type of community. And it's not something that's going to go away very quickly, even with interest in investment and so forth. You're going to have to give some reasons for these communities to buy into this idea. You're going to have a capacity to deliver on some of the promises that you're making, whether it's including many of these groups into the political process, or whether it's providing the bread and butter types of issues that many actually are facing. So this is going to be the big challenge for the future of both the leadership as well as the local communities that are very much in the heart of things.
Larry, let me read you a quote that I stumbled across in my research from Aung San Suu Kyi. She made this comment in 1993, and she said, "The greatest threat to global security today comes not from the economic deficiencies of the poorest nations, but from religious, racial and political dissensions." Interesting that she has for a long time recognized this kind of problem, and yet she has been so very quiet in recent weeks.
Well, she has been relatively quiet, but particularly in relation to the problems in Arakan, and it's because it's very difficult to know what she could actually say that wouldn't inflame either the Rohingyas or the Arakanese Buddhists. So she's preferred, I think, to remain quiet. But she's not going to be able to do that for much longer because the Speaker of the House, Shui Man, has asked her committee to look into the situation in Arakan. And I know that over the weekend she's been meeting many experts and representatives from the Arakanese communities, trying to find out much more about what's going on. So I think she's certainly going to come out within Parliament and say something fairly constructive in the near future. But I would like to emphasise that the Rohingyas are not a recognised ethnic group. It is much more a religious problem. But the whole issue of the border areas, that is where the other ethnic groups are based, is critical to Burma's future because that's where most of the resources are. And if the country is to develop strongly, it's going to have peace in all those areas where there is conflict, be it communal or be it ethnic. And that is not going to be resolved quickly, right. And it will need a political solution.
And that is exactly the point. Let me just get one final issue on the pure politics of this with Brian. Brian, the situation with regards to the bigger picture, as it were, is one that has yet to be resolved, isn't it? I mean, the US and the West largely have thrown their weight behind the reforms of Thein Sein. Aung San Suu Kyi, some might argue, being a Burman herself, has kept quiet because her interests lie in also supporting that bloc, that development model that has been proposed so far. Is this likely to work without a greater recognition of these minorities?
Well, again, let me go back to, you're absolutely right, the reform process, the international community, including the US, the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi have thrown their weight, their political power, their moral support, everything behind the reformers. This is the best opportunities Burma has had in decades to address its long-running human rights problems. But the Rohingya is an issue which really stands apart from this, in some ways threatens the entire process, because as somebody else mentioned a minute ago, the Rohingya are a stateless community. The other ethnic minorities, there are 135 recognized groups, all have, in a sense, a stake in the future of the country and are recognized members of the country. The Rohingya are distinct from this, and the violence in Arakan state threatens the entire process because it challenges the government's commitment to reform. The tools at its disposal to address the law and order situation are the same ones that were responsible for the breakdown law and order in the first place across the country. So it's a really troubling development in the country, and it's apart from the larger ethnic nationality question because of the nature of the struggle, but at the same time it is a fundamental challenge that the government will have to address if the reforms are to go forward.
All right, well, let's move on from this ethnic and political issue into what you just called, Brian, the broader process, and let's look at what is at stake here to a certain extent. And the economy is really one of the key issues, an economy that has suffered through the decades of military rule and the international sanctions that have come as a consequence of that. But economists recently have been predicting that this could be the next big economic frontier in Asia. At the moment, Myanmar still stands as one of the poorest countries in the world. Its per capita gross domestic product is just $857. The figure in Thailand, just for a case of example, is $9,500. Now, Myanmar ranks 149th out of 187 countries on the Human Development Index of the UN. That measures things like life expectancy, education and income. But the country's prospects are thought to be very, very good because of its vast reserves of natural wealth. Now, Myanmar has been the world's top rice exporter in the past, that before the 5 decades of military dictatorship made it Southeast Asia's poorest nation, and is now trying to revive that rice trade and double its exports over the 5 years. It also has vast resources of other sorts too, all of them ripe for investment. There is gas and oil, there is coal, gold, precious stones, timber and vast fisheries, all waiting to be fully utilised. Maitri, let me come to you and talk about this potential for development, because all of a sudden everyone is taking a great deal of interest in there. But it's funny that we're suddenly taking this seriously, whereas when the government there began to talk about economic modernisation, which was in the late 80s and early 90s, people never took them seriously. Should we take them more seriously now? Is there really the possibility of doing business in that country because the government that is there is still that same government?
Yeah, I think this is precisely the time this is the opening, both politically and for the economy, for folks to come in and to invest. I mean, when in the late 80s and 90s they tried to open up, this was actually precisely because of political reasons, the time when the international community decided to actually close off Myanmar from investment and so forth. And now that the situation seems to be quite different, with a different institutional structure, with a different political climate that's been created in the last 20, 25 years, it seems to be that investment is the natural, it's a natural next step. But at the same time, we have to also be cautious. If you've been there recently, it's kind of like the Wild Wild West. There are a lot of folks there who are just there to take advantage of the situation. And not quite sure what to do next, because a lot of the infrastructure that would help facilitate this type of investment is not yet ready. We still have to figure out what the foreign investment law is going to look like. American companies, for instance, will need a tax structure that they can work with. And any sort of competent businessmen will want to have some sort of protections for their investment. So these types of issues are going to have to be in place before this type of investment really actually starts to penetrate and starts to enhance the type of industries that you mentioned.
Well, you say the people there to do business right now are more like cowboys in the Wild Wild West. Larry, let me ask you, is that simply because of the nature of the investors themselves, or because of the fact that most investors are still a little bit wary? I mean, Maitri there was talking about how the political and government climate is different, but I remember speaking to you only a few years ago when they were debating the new constitution and proposing these new elections, and most people were very skeptical that this really amounted to meaningful change.
Absolutely. I think there was a lot of skepticism, and I think to some extent people are now being carried away with optimism. I think there's little doubt that Thein Sein and the cabinet, the ministers, are committed to change. They are very serious about reforming the country, both politically and economically. But there are still resistance. There is still members of parliament who have taken a hardline position and don't want to see the country open up. So I think the commitment is there. But I think that in terms of the investors who are coming in, and I was speaking to a company that deals with foreigners coming in to see what kind of prospects there are, and they said that every month they have 500 visitors from other parts of Asia, particularly the Japanese, asking questions. I think some of the businesses that have already set up are probably carpetbaggers, and at the moment many companies, particularly in the West, are being cautious, and I think quite rightly so, because as yet we haven't seen too much concrete change. I think the need for infrastructure, control of land prices, capacity, for instance, of the government civil servants is really appalling. I think this is the biggest danger to derailing the reform process, is the lack of capacity.
Do tell me, though, I mean, because of your work involved in more democracy promotion than business promotion, I mean, how are these two things going to meld? And again, it sort of brings us into the territory of the ethnic problem, because, you know, we did see over the course of the years French and American oil companies trying to operate in Burma despite the sanctions. A lot of talk about the exploitation of labor in arm in arm with the government. I mean, issues like this are still extant. Is the democracy issue progress that we've been talking about here in Burma for you a convincing one?
To date, the reform process, again, going back to even to the 2010 elections, at that point in time, it was too early to tell what the government was going to do. The reform process, the political reforms, the economic reforms have moved forward more quickly than almost anyone suspected. And one of the challenges in Burma is you actually have multiple transitions taking place simultaneously. So you're moving from a military government to some sort of political opening. It's too early to call it democratization, but hopefully it's moving in that direction. You're moving from a sort of an inward-looking, state-controlled economy to one that's trying to integrate itself into the regional economy. And you're also taking it from a very authoritarian political environment with no civil society, no independent media, to one much, much more liberalized. And so trying to manage all three of those, if not more, processes simultaneously is a big challenge, but they're clearly integrated. The country cannot introduce democratic reforms that are sustainable without introducing economic reforms. But as the other two speakers mentioned, one of the fundamental challenges in Burma. There's simply a lack of infrastructure and a lack of domestic capacity to deal with this. And so until the government introduces investment laws, the infrastructure, there's investment in infrastructure, and the country sets the framework for investment, it's hard to see how companies or which companies will go into the country other than those in the extractive industries.
Larry, the Chinese have been active in Myanmar for a long time and obviously have an interest in the resources too, as well as the fact that its strategic location is important to both China and the US. Is the battle for business and resources in Myanmar just a proxy for a greater battle for influence in that basin?
Well, I think some people would see it like that, and they might also include the Indians, although they're at a larger disadvantage than the Chinese and the Americans. But I think the Burmese government is very sensible in its approach. It is nationalist. One worries sometimes about the xenophobia, but they see that in the past, because of the sanctions, because of the Western's position, they were forced into the Chinese camp, and they fear the influence of the Chinese. Not just in terms of the business, but in terms of the regions where the ethnic minorities are. And I think that the government is trying to find a way where it can balance both the American and Chinese influence, as well as the influence of Southeast Asian countries and India. And I think, if anything, the Thein Sein government is looking to Southeast Asia, particularly Thailand, for investment and for support for the political democratization of the country. They've seen that these countries have moved from military or communist regimes in the past to more liberal economies and democracies of sorts, and they would like to follow that kind of example.
OK, we've been speculating about potential up until now. I'm going to ask all three of you to actually make some predictions as to how this is going to play out. Maichi, let me begin with you, and let me frame it in the context of the ethnic problem again, where we started. Let's look at the major port development, Daiwa, down on the coast of Burma. That tie with Thailand, from the port to Thailand, which is one of the main nexuses, focal points of the whole thing, runs directly through Karen territory. Are we going to see this being a vehicle for the Burmese government to make peace with the Karen, or are we going to see this as just being another expression of how much friction there is in that country?
Well, it's difficult to say, because you're going to be dealing with many different types of Karen, many different types of officials who have all different sorts of interests. I mean, they did sign a 13-point accord recently, so it seems like they're moving in the right direction. My point, though, is I think a little bit more critical in the sense that when we talk about these types of reforms, whether it's with that particular situation that you've mentioned or in more general, that one of the key issues, though, is what exactly are we talking about when we say the term reform? We speak of it as if it's basically a single train or a single unidirectional process, but actually it's I think several processes. I think that Brian and both Larry also mentioned. Reform, political reform or economic reform is one thing, but it's also the types of reforms in education and healthcare, providing the jobs and the infrastructure. And these things are contingent upon ethnic relations, but also these processes will, I think, we're going to continue whether or not these are resolved. I mean, yes, these are significant and serious issues for the government, but when you're talking about putting electrical poles in, doing with the sewage, getting education, getting the schools in place and so forth, I think these processes are going to occur no matter whether the ethnic situation improves or not. I think these processes are still going to move forward. So I think keeping in mind that there's many different types of reform that we're talking about, as well as competition amongst the Burmese. I mean, Larry mentioned about the capacity as being a major weakness. I completely agree. But I also worry about the factionalism within the parties, within the politicians, the personal rivalries, and infighting. That, to me, is also a big threat when it comes to talking about the type of future prospects that you've raised. Okay, Larry, to you, very quickly, in the future, are we likely to see the continuing conflicts that Maitri was talking about, or the poles in the ground, the sewage systems and the educational systems improving?
Well, I'm afraid I think we're going to see both. I think that there is going to be development. We are going to see development that actually caters for the interests of the people at the ground at village level that we didn't see under the military regime. We have seen some changes. I agree that it is not necessarily democracy that we're seeing, but we're seeing a parliamentary system. We're seeing a pluralist system. But at the same time, we're seeing a lack of capacity to move forward. For instance, in Parliament, 436 bills have been laid on the table. Only 38 of them have passed in the last 18 months. Okay. That doesn't augur well, and there's no doubt that in the end, it's the ethnic issue that's going to decide where Burma goes from here.
Brian, a final word from you very quickly.
I would agree with both the speakers. I would also add that there are two things. One is the 2015 elections and how the Democratic opposition led by the NLD, how it decides to compete in those elections, what space is given to and what space the ethnic nationality parties take in that election. But the other thing is constitutional reform. Until the Constitution is reformed and addresses the most anti-democratic aspects of their Constitution, the state really will be, in the democratization process, somewhat limited. Hopefully all of these reforms will amount to peace throughout the country and development, but it's still a long way away from prosperity and peace in the country.
All right, there we will have to leave it, gentlemen. I'd like to thank all three of you. In Singapore, we had Maitri Aung-Thwin. In Bangkok, Larry Jagan. And in Washington, D.C., Brian Joseph. And thank you for joining us on this edition of the programme. Do send us your feedback to insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks again for watching. Goodbye for now.